As the kickoff speaker for our tax panel, Chairman Baucus, who is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and we'll talk both about the budget negotiations that are going on now on the fiscal cliff, but what's really important is that both Senator Baucus and his counterpart in the House, Chairman Camp, who work together, I believe, on developing ideas for tax reform, will be some of the lead folks who are shepherding whatever kind of framework, hopefully, comes out of a fiscal cliff through their committees to help develop the details of how to do entitlement reform and tax reform. So we're very lucky to have with us today Chairman Baucus, who's somebody who's been thinking about these ideas for quite some time, has a tremendous amount of expertise, and is going to talk with us today about where the situation stands and where hopefully we'll be able to move from here. Thank you so much, Senator.
Thank you very much. And thank everyone here for putting the Fix the Debt Conference together. This is a very interesting setup. I have my back to all these luminaries here. I don't know whether it be darts in my back or spitballs, whatever it's going to be, but it's good to be here and try to help in every way I can. I first want to commend Erskine Bowles and Senator Alan Simpson, the entire coalition, for your laser-like focus on this. You are engaging the American people. That's clear. You're drawing attention to the fiscal challenges that threaten our future. I know many here today are proponents of the Simpson-Bowles plan. As you may know, I served with Senator Simpson and Mr. Bowles on the National Commission for Fiscal Responsibility and Reform, and while I agreed with many of the final report's proposals, there were several aspects I could not support at the time. However, this report has helped advance the national dialogue and has taken on increasing importance, and it should absolutely be part of our debt reduction debate. I'd like to start this morning telling you what I'm hearing at home from my Montana bosses. I'm just the hired hand. I work for all those folks in Montana. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Montana State University of Montana Cat Grizz football game. It's the biggest rivalry in not only the state, I would say it rivals many parts of the country. A rivalry that dates back more than about 112 years. We call it the Brawl of the Wild. And boy, that's what it is. It's a brawl. And sometimes I think that's what we should call the United States Congress. More than 26,000 fans crammed into Washington Grizzly Stadium to watch the annual battle on the gridiron. During the game, mostly during halftime when there was a break in the action, fans would come up to me and say, "Hi, Max, good to see you." And we start talking about football. We would often turn to Washington, especially the fiscal crisis. Not once did someone say, "Don't do this, don't raise my taxes, don't cut my favorite program." Not once did I receive a parochial entreaty or request. My Montana bosses told me, rather, again and again, "Max, just get it done. You guys need to work together. Just get it done." I was really almost stunned at the unanimity and the intensity with which people spoke to me. Get it done. Now, these folks didn't ask for stalemate. They didn't ask for inflexibility. They didn't ask for our leaders to dig in over pledges or ideological purity. They're pragmatic. The American people want Congress and the President to work together. They want us to tackle these great challenges. Keeping with the football theme, I want to share the words of Vince Lombardi, the famed Packers coach, who once said, "People who work together will win, whether it be against complex football defenses or the problems of modern society." End quote. This is a simple lesson, one we all learned as children. It's what we need to do now. Stakes couldn't be higher. More than $7 trillion of tax cuts, Medicare payments, and programs for the unemployed will expire just 27 days from today. Adding to these spending cuts and tax increases are sequestration cuts of almost 10% to both defense and non-defense, and cuts of 2% to Medicare. It'd be hard to find a single American not affected by these changes. You all know how serious this is, and you believe, like me, that we can do it to prevent the fiscal crisis. But the answer is not just to extend all of these tax cuts and delay all of these spending cuts indefinitely. That is not the answer. This is an opportunity to commit to a balanced plan to bring our national debt back down to sustainable levels. The United States, I believe, is at a critical juncture. We can come together and show the world that we're still responsible actors. We can prove that America is still the leader of the global economy. People are watching. Do we still have it? Or we can let obstructionism and stagnation turn this country we all love so much into a second-rate superpower. I spent a few days last fall meeting with the European leaders, as they're about a week, meeting with finance ministers, head of the European Commission, and anybody I could talk to try to get a sense of Europe, both the peripheral countries as well as Germany and Finland, and each with different points of view, but also all with a common view. That is, they've got to find a way to work out all their differences to save the euro. And I believe they will. You could just see it, feel it, reading between the lines, listen to the music as well as the words. They're going to find a way. They're going to muddle through it, but they're going to find a way to get it done. These countries are also looking for us to lead, and we need to lead. Europe shows us the danger of uncertainty. We all know that, and we know the uncertainty that exists in this country. Uncertainty leaves businesses sitting at the sidelines. It drags down investment in the economy and human capital. Companies will postpone decisions the next quarter, or maybe the following quarter, not hire, not do what they would otherwise like to do, especially with all that cash. We can't leave people wondering what's coming down the pike every few months. Confidence matters. It especially matters in our economy. Once we resolve the cliff, we need long-term fiscal reduction so businesses can plan for the future. To give families and businesses certainty, we must agree in the next few weeks on specific spending cuts and specific revenue increases that reduce the deficit to avoid the fiscal cliff. We should not put off the hard decisions with gimmicks or with triggers. That's what got us here in the first place. It's time to bite the bullet and make the tough decisions and make them now. The first thing we should do is immediately and permanently extend the middle-class tax cuts. This will provide needed certainty to America's families and businesses and markets. This decisive action will ensure that millions of American families don't see a tax hike of more than $2,000 starting next month. Any year-end agreement must also include a long-term extension of the debt ceiling. America cannot afford another debilitating fiscal showdown. It has to be a package deal. And then we need to enact a long-term and comprehensive deficit solution. Most serious plans recommend about $4 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years to restore fiscal balance. The Budget Control Act banked about $1 trillion. Bringing our troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan saves another $800 billion. That's real savings, and it should be counted. Interest savings provide another $600 billion. And there's no reason we can't come together to find at least $2 trillion in additional deficit reduction, getting us to more than $4 trillion. This plan will strengthen the economy, put us on a sustainable path forward, and it must ramp up over time to avoid slowing down the economic recovery. 40% of the long-term growth of federal health programs is due to rising health care costs generally, 40%. 60% is due to Americans aging. In fact, each and every day, 10,000 Americans turn 65. Every day, 10,000 Americans enter Medicare, turn 65. As chairman of the Finance Committee, I can influence a lot of policies, but I can't keep folks from getting older. We need to focus on what we can influence, and that's overall health care costs. Shifting costs to seniors is not the solution. We cannot break the promise of Medicare and Social Security. That's bedrock. We cannot break that promise. I was proud to help craft the Affordable Care Act, and we took major steps to slow the growth of health care spending and strengthen both Medicare and Medicaid. But there's still more to do. This morning's panel focused on reforming health care spending. This is critical. But we need to focus on facts. If you turned on any television during the campaign season, you likely saw fiction. Attack ad after attack ad claiming billions in cuts to Medicare, putting America's seniors at risk. Nothing could be further from the truth. There were 0 cuts to Medicare beneficiaries in the Affordable Care Act. 0. These ads are the exact types of misleading political attacks that prevent progress. Both parties are certainly guilty. I'll be the first to admit, but no one will be able to come together on these tough decisions, if and when we do, if they're used as red-hot issues to brand each other. There'll be no winners if both sides continue these kinds of fights. We rise and fall as one nation. Right now, crippling levels of debt are choking off economic vitality. It threatens the strength of our economy and our children and our grandchildren's prosperity. The debt to GDP ratio is currently 73%, the highest since World War II, and growing. But over the past few years, revenues as a share of GDP have shrunk to the lowest they have been since World War II. As more and more baby boomers retire, it's simply a fact we need revenues above historical averages to deal with this demographic reality. We are simply not raising enough revenue. We need real, significant new revenue this month. Once that revenue is locked in, we can then turn to overhauling our tax code with a modern economy. I'm committed to tax reform. I could have no better partner in this mission than my good friend, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dave Camp. I've been developing a plan that will help create jobs, spark innovation, expand opportunity. We have a lot of work to do in a short amount of time, but I am optimistic. We can restore confidence in America. A balanced solution will provide America a fiscal course correction. And when we reach a meaningful deal, and I'm confident that we will, every credit rating agency will have restored America's AAA rating. There are good people on the other side of the aisle, like my colleague, Senator Hatch, who recognize the seriousness of the challenge we face. Working together, we can get this done. Working together, we can restore America's economic vitality. So I'll conclude where I began, taking you back to the Cat Grizz football game in Montana. At the end of the Brawl of the Wild, when the final whistle blew, players from the opposing teams gathered at midfield to shake hands. They had just beaten each other to a pulp into the frozen ground for the past 60 minutes. Yet, at the end of the game, they could come together, and they did. And thousands of fans who spent the weekend steeped in rivalry left the stadium, not as a Bobcat, not as a Grizzly, but as Montanans, as Americans. This is the spirit we need now. We need to come together to resolve the fiscal crisis. It's the only way forward. Now is the time to get to work. Before I finish my final sentence, thank you and happy holidays. I'm just reminded of something I often remind myself of and say it on occasion, and something I believe, and that is this. All of us, everybody in this room, all of us in Congress, all of us who aspire to positions of leadership and have the public trust, even those of us who aren't in public positions, all of us have a moral responsibility. When we leave this place, we leave it as good a shape or better shape than we found it. All of us. And if we follow that moral obligation, not only would we be helping our kids and our grandkids, but more importantly, we'd be helping ourselves and we'd be doing the right thing. We all have that moral obligation. We leave this place, and we're not here forever. We're here just a short time. But when we do leave it in as good a shape or better shape than we found it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Chairman Baucus for joining us. And I'm going to now turn the stage back over to Peter Cook from Bloomberg, who's going to moderate our next panel on tax reform. Thank you.
Chairman, you're welcome to stick around and get some ideas, but I got a funny feeling you need to head back to the Hill. But we hope to come up with some answers here, some ideas from this esteemed panel. We have We'll write them down and send them up. I know Sean Neary. I'll hand it to your staffer when. All right, you hear it. You hear the mission here, folks. We have to come up with some ideas that can pass Congress and meet with everyone's approval. So no small task.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Baucus. There are some new faces at the table, and again, we want to welcome all of you. I'm going to go around the table really quickly and introduce at least our new faces. We've got Bill Gale from the Brookings Institution, who's done a lot on tax policy issues, fiscal issues. Welcome, Bill. We have as well Larry Lindsay of the Lindsay Group, a former economic advisor, of course, to President Bush and governor at the Federal Reserve Board. Larry Lindsay, welcome. Governor Bredesen is still with us. John Podesta, the chairman of the Center for American Progress, of course, chief of staff to Bill Clinton. Welcome. I'm going to note that John does have to leave us a little bit early, so I might go to him first when we start the questioning. Donald Marin as well, the director of the Urban Institute's Tax Policy Center, co-director with Bill, so we'll see if you two disagree on anything. That would be good. We've got Will Marshall as well. He's joining us from the Progressive Policy Institute, the founder and president of the Progressive Policy Institute. We have Senator Bob Packwood of Oregon, served Oregon for 26 years, also was a former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, part of the 86 tax reform negotiations. Hope to get your thoughts on that. And again, the other folks here have been part of the conversation. My only message to the new arrivals is please jump in wherever you see fit. We don't have, we have about an hour to an hour and a half, and it's amazing how quickly it flies by. If you hear something you want to weigh in on, please don't wait for me, but I'm going to direct the conversation as best I can and try and let everyone offer their perspective. We're talking now about the other very small issue in this debate right now, and that is tax policy and how best to put the nation on a sustainable fiscal path and incorporating changes in tax policy to get there. The question of revenue, how much, where to get it, the options on the table, and would like all your thoughts. As you heard from Chairman Baucus, they need some ideas, apparently both sides right now, to try and bridge this gap, because right now we appear to be at somewhat of a stalemate. With that, I'm going to turn it over first to John Podesta to get your thoughts, again, knowing that John has to leave, and also that the Center for American Progress has today come out with some ideas. And John, maybe you'd like to weigh in on some of those and your thoughts on this debate.
Well, Peter, I think that following up on this morning's sessions, clearly, I think in order to have a balanced approach, we need both revenue and we need spending restraint. We need the ideas that you talked about this morning with respect to restraint, particularly in the big entitlements and Medicare specifically, and I think Nira was here and talked about that, but we also need new revenue. We spent about the last year trying to think through how did you get revenue, and I think we probably borrowed ideas from both sides, but we put together a group of people who were quite experienced: Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, Bill Daley, Roger Altman, Les Samuels, well-known names, Antonio Weissner and I. And we really tried to work through how would you raise enough revenue to actually hit the Simpson-Bowles target. We calculated that to be about $1.8 trillion over 10 years. That's a little bit higher than the president and significantly higher than the Republican offer. We did that by removing the alternative minimum tax, repealing other provisions that add complexity, and eliminating unjustified tax loopholes. But primarily we did it by converting the current system of deductions which favor high-income taxpayers to a system of tax credits which equalizes the benefit that middle-income as well as high-income taxpayers get. We restored the top rate to 39.6%. I know there's a lot of debate about whether you can lower the rate. Our judgment was you needed that rate in order to have a progressive distribution of income, and I think it's incumbent upon other people to come forward to show how they can get the income that's necessary to deal with our fiscal problem and be specific about how they would take to take the loopholes and deductions out of the system and how much that will hit the middle class. And overall, the plan, I think, tries to protect people in the middle and at the bottom, try to deal with the problem of income inequality, and we think it's it's an important contribution to tax reform going forward. We don't anticipate that a full-blown tax reform proposal, as the senator suggested, will take place in the next few weeks, but hopefully the parameters of a budget deal that gets to that $4 trillion mark that everyone's talking about, that includes significant tax reform, will be the first order of business in 2013, and this is an important contribution to the debate.
Let me ask you one specific, if I could, just to educate myself as I report on this. Your proposal you put forward, more revenue than the president. What about the actual trigger for, again, some of the capping those deductions, limiting those deductions? Is it the 250,000 mark?
No, instead we convert to an 18% credit rather than putting an overall cap on deductions, which Governor Romney had proposed in the campaign. And I'll tell you, I think the reason we did that, having considered it, Bill's certainly probably one of the leading experts in the country on this question, is that if you simply limit deductions, it has a differential effect, particularly on charitable contributions, because for high-income taxpayers, that cap on deductions will be eaten up by state and local income tax deductions, and what you're doing is really socking it to the charitable sector by just putting a hard cap on deductions. So we thought it was better to equalize the rate by going to a credit system. That way, middle class, higher income people all get 18% deduction rather than a millionaire getting 35 cents on the dollar for a dollar of mortgage interest deduction versus a teacher who gets 15 cents on the dollar. We think that's both unfair and unproductive, and this is a way of equalizing that.
All right, so that's the offer from the Center for American Progress. And Larry Lindsay, I'm going to assume that this is probably a plan that maybe doesn't meet your test, probably won't meet the test of House Republicans as well. I'll give you the chance to weigh in on what the Center for American Progress has put forward, but more importantly, how would you bridge the divide right now between where John Boehner is and President Obama on the specific issue of revenue and overhauling the tax code?
Well, thank you. My job is to tell my clients what's going to happen, not what I would like to have happen. And so what I'd like to do is take a close look at what's being proposed. First of all, with regard to taxes and deductions, what I'm struck by is how rapidly the debate is moving away from Bowles-Simpson. Bowles-Simpson said, broaden the base, lower the rates. We now have the president proposing raising the rates and opposing a base broadening measure in the form of capping itemized deductions. Republicans want to keep the rate the same and broaden the base, but that's very different. And I think that Bowles-Simpson had it right. I looked very carefully at the logic the White House had with regard to the idea of capping itemized deductions. And I'd just like to take a look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. Because what we're looking at is tax expenditures, and we should weigh costs and benefits in doing it. They said that they were against it for two reasons. The first was that it affected some taxpayers making less than $250,000, which is true. This would be a $50,000 cap. So the people we're talking about are people who are using way above average levels of itemized deductions on their return at that level. When I do the analysis using the tabulated data, I get about 1.2 million taxpayers with incomes under $250,000 over the $50,000 cap. Well, according to the White House, they are proposing to get around that a phase-in method that costs $200 billion over the 10 years. So if you apportion that to protect these 1.2 million taxpayers, all of whom will have a tax increase of a few thousand, not much more than that, they're basically going to do a transfer equal to $180,000 per taxpayer. That will be the revenue cost of their phase-in proposal. Now, that just doesn't meet my standard of cost-benefit analysis. So I think that that one kind of falls away. Their second argument has to do with the protection of charity. Now, my very first paper was on the charitable deduction, and I'm a great believer in it and tax incentives for it. But again, I think we have to take a careful look at it from a cost-benefit point of view. According to my good friend Gene Sperling and Jason Furman in their NEC blog, they estimate that the proposal to cap the deduction will cost about $100 billion in charitable giving over the next 10 years. The revenue cost involved is $200 billion. So if I understand the White House's cost-benefit analysis correctly, in order to have $100 billion of extra charitable giving to charities by the choice of the rich, the general taxpayer has to give up twice as much, or $200 billion. Again, that really doesn't meet the basic tests of cost-benefit analysis. So whether it's giving $180,000 in revenue cost in order to protect some artificial line, or having a cost to the taxpayer of $2 for every additional dollar of charitable giving that the rich people are going to give, I'm sorry, but the White House's analysis just doesn't meet standard cost-benefit analysis, which may be why we have trillion-dollar deficits. I don't know. I think that there are lots of ways of doing this. I think capping the itemized deduction gets at the people you want to, gets revenue from the people you want to get it from, and does so in a way that is minimally distorting. And it fits in with the Bowles-Simpson approach of broadening the base and at least not raising the rates.
I'm going to go to Senator Packwood, one of our other new arrivals here, as I mentioned before, was part of the 86 discussions. Bring some of that perspective to this conversation if you can.
Well, let me talk about the process as to how this was done, because I think the process could be duplicated. But you got a different situation. You want to raise revenue, you want to take care of Medicare and Medicaid. All we were trying to do in 86 was lower the rates, corporate and individual, on a revenue-neutral basis. In fact, that's what President Reagan said. If you raise money with it or lower money with it, I'll veto it. The House had worked all 1985 on this bill, and they were having, frankly, a hell of a time. And finally, close to Christmas, they brought it on the floor. Purely a Democrat bill. Remember what the House was in 1985. The Republicans had not controlled it for 30 years. The Democrats regarded them as irrelevant to any process, so the bill was a Democrat bill. So all the Republicans in committee and on the floor voted against it. Unfortunately, about 50 or 60 Democrats didn't like it either. And when the procedural motion was brought up for no amendments on the bill, the motion failed, and it was going to be open for amendments on the floor, and it would kill the bill. So the bill was pulled back. The president at this stage calls the Republicans and said, vote for the bill. If it comes to me in this fashion, I'll veto it. They bring the bill up again. Nobody wants its fingerprints on it, and it passes on a voice vote. It comes to the Senate, and we start working out about March, and we're kind of treading water, and not going forward, not going backwards. I wasn't satisfied with the progress. So one day, I just said to my chief of staff, let's go to the Irish Times, have a beer, and see what we can do. Well, we went to the Irish Times. We had 2 pitchers of beer. And you'd be amazed what kind of courage that gives you.
That's where all grand bargains are formed?
Well, that's where it's, assuming that this Friday is day 0, I called the head of the Joint Tax Committee. He said, give me a tax bill with a 25% tax rate. He said, you'll have to get rid of mortgage interest. I said, what about 26%? And he says, I'll come back next week and I'll give you. So he comes back on Tuesday. This is now day 4, and he has 3 bills, 25%, 26%, 27% top rates. And here are the deductions you have to do to get rid of it. And I thought, well, we're not going anyplace the way we are. So on Thursday, which is now day 6, I called the committee together in public meeting and just lay out the ideas. It wasn't even a bill. Just lay out the ideas of here's what's conceivably possible. And at the end of the meeting, a number of them were nodding and saying, well, yeah, maybe that would work. So at this stage, I thought, how do I put this together? And I spend the next 3 days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, calling 6 senators, Pat Moynihan, Bill Bradley, George Mitchell, Jack Danforth, John Chafee, and Malcolm Wallop. Would they be willing to meet in my office in secret, starting on Tuesday morning at 8:30? And here's the goal we will be trying to work toward. Closing loopholes, I use that word when I talk to the Democrats, because they like the idea of closing loopholes. And I say to the Republicans, and lowering rates. Well, they like lowering rates. So you had the possibility of a marriage. And we start to meet 8:30 on Tuesday morning in secret, the 7 of us, along with a small staff. Then at 10 o'clock, the Finance Committee would meet, but it would just perform the meetings. And then we met Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and of course there are no secrets. You could see the interest groups that we were going to hit start to gather. Not many on Tuesday, Wednesday, a fair crowd. Thursday, the entire hearing room was full. Friday, they were out in the hallways. We had to set up a speaker system. They could see what was coming. And Friday afternoon, I announced we weren't going to have any more meetings, and it was a warm day, and it's May, and why don't you guys go and golf or sail? They all cheered. The next day, Howard said to the committee, but for those who are still interested, the 7 of us, we could meet tomorrow. And they all said yes. We met on Saturday morning, the 7 of us. No press and no lobby around. They'd all gone. And at that stage, we finished it. Dramatic cuts in the IRS, dramatic cuts in investment tax credit, almost the elimination of passive losses. And we had the rates down. I was all set, and I was ready to go on Monday in final passage. And on Sunday, Lloyd Benson calls. He wants back for the oil and gas industry something called working interest. It's a form of passive losses that we had just gotten rid of for all other industries, and he wanted it back for oil and gas. And I thought to myself, I can beat him 12-8, 13-7, but then I've got the opposition of all these guys. So I said, all right, Lloyd, I'll give it to you on the condition you support everything else in the bill. Dunny says, when will we do this? I said, late on the last night of the markup, and don't talk to anybody about it. He says, you'll vote for it? And I said, no, no. I said, I'll get you the votes. I'm not going to vote for this turkey. But, and I had to lean on Danforth and Chafee and others to vote for this thing, but when it came up, it passed. And at that stage, we go out. Now it's only the 19th day from the time of the 2-pitcher lunch, and about 1:30 in the morning, it passes 20-0. And the press loved it, conservative academics loved it, liberal academics loved it. By this time, it was inevitable something like this would pass. We had long battles on the Senate floor and some close votes, but it passes there 97-3. Now, could that be duplicated? Forget whether or not you're going to raise the rates or lower the rates. Could the process be duplicated? And I can only see 2 ways it could be done. One, the president calls no more than about 20 people together at Camp David, and he says, we're going to be here all weekend. In fact, we may stay all week, and we're not coming out until we know we're agreed. And everybody, he knows the problem. Republicans know the problem. Democrats know the problem. You're going to have to stem the increase in entitlements, and the Republicans are going to have to give on revenue. And I think everybody knows that. They just don't want to take the first step, and they don't want to admit it. It could be done that way, or it could be done in Congress if either the House or the Senate can put together that kind of a bipartisan group, and you'd have to do it in secret, and you want to do it quick before the opposition can gather. And I mean do it within 10 days to 2 weeks. But could it be done? Yes. And then I'll close with just one humorous comment. When we'd finished at 1:30 in the morning at 20-0 in the Finance Committee, Dick Darman, the Undersecretary of the Treasury, had been working with us. The President and Jim Baker, Treasury Secretary, were in Japan. The President was gone on one of these 7 or 8 day economic things and visit the Philippines and visit Indonesia and whatnot. So Darman calls Baker, and I'm assuming it's about 12 hours difference in Japan. He says, Jim, the President's going to love this bill. He said, he's really going to love it. And there's a pause while Baker's talking. He said, Jim, just tell him to shut up. He says, his friends are not going to like this bill, and they're going to want to get to him, but the President is going to like it, and don't let him say anything until I have a chance to fully brief you and you can brief him. And that's the way it happened. That's the way the bill passed, and that was the process.
That was the process back in 1986. Will Marshall, can that be the process today? It sounds like feels like it's a different environment right now.
So like watching Lincoln, politics when it actually worked. I don't know, but right now we're obviously in the middle of a political test of wills on marginal tax rates. It's interesting that we're not fighting over the underlying principle, which is that wealthy people ought to pay more in order to help us close debts and deficits, get our economy back on track. So right now the President thinks he won a point, thinks he was vindicated by his victory in the election, and wants the Republicans to give on marginal tax rates. They don't want to do that. And I don't know how that's going to come out, but I think he's got the whip hand in this struggle. And restoring the Clinton tax rates is certainly something I would support. We supported them back you know, in '91 before when Bill Clinton was just running for president. So no problem on that, but it's a reasonable adjustment, but it may not be sufficient to reach the revenue targets that we need, and it doesn't help us bargain in bipartisan bargaining, reaching a deal. So I hope that as this negotiation, it ought to be at the Irish Times, wherever these negotiations take place, that they will, you know, that they will not make a fetish of marginal tax rates. I think, you know, they should go up some, but do they need to go back to where they were? I don't know. There are lots of ways to increase taxes on rich people, and it may be that a hybrid of marginal tax increases and the kind of base broadening, loophole closing, expenditure closing that Simpson-Bowles proposed also should be part of the mix. And frankly, raising marginal rates doesn't, you know, doesn't guarantee that you hit your intended target. You know, very rich people depend more on investment income than on their labor income. So if you want to really get them, and this is why Mitt Romney was able to pay a 14% effective tax rate on earnings of about $14 million. So if you're really trying to get the super rich, the top tenth of 1%, it may be that marginal tax rate increases doesn't serve your purpose there. So whatever happens now, you know, whatever kind of deal gets through this initial period, I think next year we have to look forward to a fundamental tax reform that will boost growth and competitiveness. We can't just leave it, you know, with the debate. We have to have a more comprehensive change. And I understand, and learning from people like Bill Gale and others, that you get your biggest efficiency gains by getting rid of a lot of the distortions and loopholes and preferences in the tax code on both the personal side and on the corporate side. So I hope we get back to that. Simpson-Bowles seems to me had the right target, you know, in terms of, you know, how much revenue they'd raise in this way. But the principle of the '86 reform seems to me to be still something, ought to be a lodestar for comprehensive tax reform. That is the lowest possible rates on the broadest possible base. So that's next year. That's a comprehensive tax reform principle. I don't think it's the one that's going to get us through the immediate crisis.
Let me turn to Bill Gale, if I could, and get your perspective on, again, the notion of getting rid of these deductions, cleaning out the underbrush, and the effect that would have in terms of, again, generating revenue for the government and the options on the table. What will produce the revenue that's needed to get this kind of grand bargain?
All right, thank you. In terms of thinking about getting rid of the deductions or expanding the base, there's basically three approaches that we can take. One is the overall cap, either capping the total amount of deductions or capping the tax value of deductions, like Maya and Marty Feldstein have put forth. And the advantage of that is that politically you're not actually attacking anyone's specific subsidy. You're just saying we're putting a cap on the overall system. A second level is what John Podesta mentioned, which was we are going to change specific items, but we're going to change them all in the same way. So yes, we're changing yours, but you're not special. We aren't picking on you. And so we're going to change all the deductions to 18% credits or something like that. The third way, which is probably the perfect way from the economic approach, is to deal with each of these on an individual basis. Tax expenditures generally cover an enormous range of activities, whether it's exclusions or deductions or credits or lower rates, et cetera. We call them all tax expenditures, but it shouldn't hide the underlying heterogeneity. So a package that went after, say, the mortgage interest deduction is not economically justified might simultaneously keep the charitable deduction as an effort to help the nonprofit sector. And every economist has their own favorite list of how they would tweak each one of them. The problem is, politically, then you're going after specific sectors, and that, as Senator Packwood just discussed, that will generate enormous opposition to that particular provision. So as far as the economics is concerned, I think we know the direction we want to go. We want to expand the base. What I don't get is how the politics of this is going to work. I don't see the Democrats throwing housing, charity, or health under the bus in order for lower rates for the wealthy. And I don't see Republicans throwing capital gains, dividends, retirement accounts, or other saving incentives under the bus in order to get lower rates. So the question is, where does the revenue from the lower rates come from? I think the answer ultimately will be from somewhere outside of the income tax system, either a value-added tax or a carbon tax.
Anyone want to weigh in on those ideas? We want to add the value-added tax and the carbon tax into this negotiation right now with John Boehner and President Obama. David Cody, I see you smiling down there.
I was waiting for Judd actually to jump in on the discussion about a VAT tax. Because he's the one that convinced me.
Well,
are you proposing that as part of the current negotiations, Bill?
No, I think ultimately they've already got more than they can handle.
Yeah.
And the revenue targets they need to reach, or the spending targets they need to reach now aren't enormous. But if you look down the road, in particular at healthcare spending, and given the discussion we had before, we can do everything we want to try to control healthcare spending, but another way to help control healthcare spending is to earmark a value-added tax revenue toward healthcare spending, which would have an immediate link between how much we spend, how much people have to pay in taxes. It would eliminate the regressivity of the VAT, because people were getting benefits for what they were paying for, and it would, to make a bad health pun, it would inoculate the deficit from uncertainty about healthcare reform. So healthcare reform is going to take a long time. It's even more complicated than tax reform. We've had one major tax reform in the last 50 years, thanks to Senator Packwood and others. Healthcare reform is going to take a long time. We can't wait to fix the deficit until we fix the healthcare system. So I think including a VAT as a way to pay for healthcare would solve the deficit situation while still allowing us the flexibility to do whatever we needed to on the healthcare side.
Well,
go ahead.
My name was taken in vain by Dave, as it often. But first off, let me say that any tax policy should have as its foundation the purposes of creating, obviously, fairness, but growth. I mean, that's what we should try to have as our goal here relative to tax reform. And I do think Simpson-Bowles got it right. I was on the commission, and I feel very strongly about that, that you create a much better tax policy if you reduce rates and give people an incentive to invest for the purpose of return rather than for the purposes of avoiding taxes. And there's a lot we can talk about. But on the VAT tax, my theory, having served as governor and in the Senate for a while, is that all government moves left. The speed at which it moves to the left depends on, think of it as a train, depends on how many engines are on the train. The engines at the state level are revenue sources. At the federal level, they're the capacity to borrow and revenue sources. And if you put an engine of value-added tax on any train, whether it's a state sales tax or a federal value-added tax, you're going to dramatically expand the size of the government as a percent of the gross national product. And I understand that if you come from the viewpoint that we need a much bigger government, something in the vicinity of 30% of the economy, there's probably no way you can pay for it with an income tax system, because the fact is, as I think Mark said, you've never gotten more than 14% out of the income tax system. Could you make that point?
Yeah, that was a guy from the Heritage.
And
it's right, though.
Yeah, and so you need a huge new revenue source. Well, I come from New Hampshire, and we've had an experience of this in New England. New Hampshire has no income tax, it has no sales tax. Every state around New Hampshire, and the other New England states, had one or the other going into the 1960s, 1970 period. And every state around us added another one. They either added the sales tax or they added the income tax, with the representation to their people that the other tax would come down and that revenue would be effectively used because it would be more effectively collected, especially if they used a sales tax. Every one of those states, their revenues haven't gone down, their revenues have gone up dramatically, and the income tax has gone up, and the sales tax has gone up, and the size of the government has gone up. So, from my standpoint, a value-added tax is just a way to grossly expand the size of the government, and it does not fix our revenue problems. And more importantly than that, just to put where I think this argument ends up, the American people would annihilate any party that passed a national sales tax. I mean, the Democratic Party thinks they're in charge now, and they are. And the Republican Party's done some things to marginalize itself, which are unfortunate. But if you want to resurrect the Republican Party, give me a value-added tax.
For the purposes of discussion, let's take the value-added tax then off the table for this discussion. And I want to turn to Donald Marin, who's another one of our new arrivals, and bring it back sort of to the reality of where we are today and get your numbers perspective on this. As we heard, Speaker Boehner offered up to the President $800 billion in revenue, all through closing loopholes, dealing with deductions, no increase in rates. First of all, on the basic math, can you get to $800 billion over 10 years that way? How would you do it, not knowing exactly all the specifics that he offered up? And more importantly, as I work my sources on Capitol Hill and I look at what the President's offered, $1.6 trillion, I've heard a lot of people split the difference at $1.2 trillion. Could you get to $1.2 trillion simply by limiting deductions, perhaps installing caps there without raising rates?
Great. So I'm going to play the think tank or inside Washington card and for a moment go back to what's not possibly achievable and then come back to that.
Okay.
So if you think about, from my point of view, from an economic perspective, kind of the hierarchy of the best ways to raise more revenue. The first, as the Senator mentioned and as I think a group of people earlier today mentioned, growth is undoubtedly the best way to raise additional revenue, if you can find a way to do that. We often talk about growth inside the fiscal discussion, and that's important, but we shouldn't lose track of the fact that there are other things we can do as a nation to encourage growth. You know, an obvious one is to think about intelligent immigration reform. That has significant fiscal impacts, but tends to be outside the box of these discussions, and at some point ought to be something that's brought back in. The second is, and this is the other thing outside the box that Bill mentioned that just deserves a little asterisk here, the next best way to raise revenue is to tax things you don't like, right? And so to the extent that we're worried about climate change and carbon emissions, doing something like a carbon tax, again, right, this is on the 10-year plan, not the 1-year plan, is an attractive place to look for revenue. Next most attractive is consumption tax, value-added tax, or there are actually some ingenious ways to turn the income tax into something that looks like a consumption tax. That's probably the best way to raise large amounts of revenue, although it raises some distributional concerns. And then you finally come to fixing the income tax. And on fixing the income tax, you know, I'm clearly, you know, my bumper sticker on my car, if I had one, would be broaden the base, lower the rates. That you want to go after the tax preferences. You know, we can, for fun, call them loopholes. Keep in mind that, in fact, most of them are fundamental social and economic policies, right? Charity, state and local, health, all those things. They're the right place to look. As a budget matter, these ideas of broad-based caps on them make sense from kind of an arithmetic point of view, that if you're aggressive enough in doing that, you can raise the kind of numbers you were describing. Now, as Larry was pointing out, if you decide to limit it only to the people who are 250 and up, you start losing significant amounts of money. And there are two reasons, right? The first is, it turns out there's actually a lot of money in potential taxes in people who earn, say, between 75 and 250, right? Kind of the middle class, there's a lot of money there. And so if you were willing to have these limits apply to those folks, you could raise more money. And then the other is if you decide to have a cap that kicks in at something like 250, you have to figure out a phase-in. And the phase-in is going to cost you additional money as well. And so on a blackboard, I think you could get up to the kinds of numbers that Speaker Boehner has mentioned, although I haven't seen what specifics are behind it. But to the extent that you start putting additional constraints on that, I don't want to do charity, I don't want to hit certain people, you start really trimming that number down.
All right, I want to expand this out. Maya, I want to let you get into this conversation as well. You've heard some ideas put forward here. You all have offered some of your own.
Well, I want to start just by taking a step back in terms of what we're trying to do in the overall fixing the budget. It is an opportunity to actually reform our overall budget, as well as put in place a $4 or $5 trillion deal that would stabilize the debt. There are a lot of things that are wrong with our budget. And when you think about the spending side, you don't want to just reduce spending. You want to think about how to shift our spending away from consumption to more investment. And you want to think about how to change our entitlement programs so that they're there for the long term, not squeezing out the rest of the budget, and also strengthening them for the most vulnerable. On the tax side, there's no question that you want to reform the tax system, right? There's pretty much nobody who should want to be in the business of defending our current tax code. Just to start with the most stunning of the numbers, we have over $1 trillion, well over $1 trillion a year in lost revenues because of all the tax breaks that run through the tax code. And generally, They're regressive, they're inefficient, they're ineffective, they have virtually no oversight. They kind of run on automatic pilot. And the problem is we all love them, because at the end of the year, when you pay your taxes, you think, oh, look, I'm getting money back. I got some tax breaks. So they're incredibly, incredibly popular, but if you listen to a group of experts, there are very few people who'd want to defend them. And so I agree with sort of Bill and Donald in talking about, those who talked about the different ways you can reform the tax code on the income tax. The single best thing we would do is go through and look at the $1 trillion+ in tax expenditures. Again, that's a year. And think about how we want to change them. Do you really want to subsidize vacation homes? Do we really need to subsidize the home mortgage all the way up to $1 million per mortgage? The fact that our health care exclusion is contributing to health care inflation is not only tax reform, it's health care reform. We would want to tackle all of those things. I think many of us fear that right now the political system is not really well equipped to take on all these hard battles. So then you come to kind of some of the second best options, which is there a way to limit these tax deductions, either through caps, or there are a lot of different ways you can formulate this so that you could limit the deductions or the tax expenditures. And you can actually meet a number of targets. You can meet a progressivity target. You can meet a different revenue target by changing a couple things. What kinds of things would be capped in a tax expenditure cap? How you would do it, if you'd have progressive rates or a dollar limit, or phase it out at the upper income. And there are also ways to offset some of those costs. So if people below 250 were getting hit, and that were your litmus test that they can't, you can actually compensate for that in other ways in the tax code. But I guess my main point would be, we don't want to walk away from the opportunity to reform the tax code. This is, you know, it's Swiss cheese. It's the thing that everybody hates. It's really hard to fix these problems. One of the reasons that people talk about broadening the base and lowering the rates is actually because that's what helps you see the incentive to broadening the base. We lose so much money every year that you can actually reduce the deficit significantly, lower the rates, still have the group that you're asking to pay more if you're willing to broaden the base. So I guess the point that I would make is that as difficult as it is, we should use this opportunity to think about what a most sensible tax system is. And one of the pieces that we've made real progress on is we know we're going to have real revenues as part of a budget deal. That, along with the spending and entitlements, is critically important. No matter how we decide to raise that, or no matter how much we raise those revenues, whether it's small amount, medium amount, big amount, we should certainly strive to raise them in the most efficient way possible. And that's why including tax reform as part of this overall deal, I think, is a critical part of growth and shouldn't be lost in the mix.
David Cody, want to get in?
Yeah, I'm going to echo a number of Maya's comments, because the way I've described it to numbers is that if we had actually been trying to develop an incomprehensible, confusing, and globally uncompetitive system, we couldn't have done a better job than what we've got. And there's this scientific principle called entropy that says all organized systems evolve to chaos. And when I look at where we started in 1985 and 86 with tax reform, I'd say that's probably pretty much where we've gotten to at this point. So I recognize, again, that I would say there's a short-term problem and a long-term problem, and that we ought to find a way to be addressing both of those. On the short term, we need more revenue, and we need something, getting back to this market-credible $4 trillion deal. You need something that markets can look at and say, I know the debt is going to go down because of the reduced health care spending, because I can see it and I know exactly it's there and it's going to show up. The same thing is true on the taxes, that I know it's there and I know it's going to show up, so I can believe that that $4 trillion is credible. However, in the long term, we should be taking the opportunity to address our total system, as Maya was saying. The world has changed significantly from where we were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, there were only 1 billion active participants in the global economy. If you look at, it was really just the US, Western Europe, and Japan. Today, there's 4 trillion people participating in the global economy. When you add China, India, CIS states, and others that have recognized prosperity comes from the private sector. We've got the same antiquated tax system today that we had 20 years ago. We should be taking the opportunity to relook this thing and say, what does it take to be globally competitive today? And yes, I was on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, so some might think that I'm like that, our proposal a lot, which I did. I don't think it has to be exactly like that, but I do think there are some principles that are important in there. This whole idea of doing individual, corporate, cap gains, do it all at the same time, I think makes sense. The territorial system for companies makes sense with the right anti-abuse clauses so that nothing screwy happens. That we relook all of these deductions as we look at simplifying the system, because every deduction, while important to somebody, is a market distortion. And we ought to be looking at, do we want all these market distortions at a time when our economy needs a lot more flexibility to respond to a very globally different place than we had 20 years ago? So I think it's a shame to pass up this opportunity to actually fix and get the Band-Aids off of a system that's just evolved to chaos over the last 25 years. And I have to say I was especially heartened to hear Senator Packwood talk about how quickly this happened last time, because I've had too many people in Washington explain to me that last time this was a 2-year process and that we don't have 2 years to do this. So hearing that it actually can be handled pretty quickly when you get some rational people in a room, I found quite encouraging.
Peter, could I jump in on
Please,
that just
go
from
ahead.
a business perspective? And I would champion everything that Dave said. But I would add this, that what is never discussed about in enough detail is how much this is costing us as an economy by not acting. The paralysis is unbelievable. So when you talk about the uncertainty and the inability to make investment decisions, to make long-term planning, to say nothing of attracting new capital to the United States in a increasingly, I've got 70 offices in 26 countries. So what, you're competing in a much different landscape with an antiquated system. But I would say I come from the world that says you can have it all. Take anything you want. Take all the exemptions, take all the expenditures, you can have them all today, because there's no way that that could be costing me as much as the absence of a decision while we all wait. And so that lack of productivity, the hit to productivity is huge. So I would, I'm in the camp on the back of all of the stuff that Dave said, that there's an urgency to this that speaks to our very viability in the entire global economy. So it's all due haste.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that. I want to get the Congressman to weigh in here. Let me paint a picture for you. You have the opportunity to bring the President of the United States and John Boehner to the Irish Times to solve this tax issue, to split the difference between where they are right now. Can you tell me what might play on the Republican side and the President's side, your fellow Democrats in Congress right now? What could pass if you have that opportunity?
Well, first of all, I think it would be a 3-pitcher event this time. When I hear Bob Packwood talk about the history of putting this bill together, 30 years ago, I'm impressed what a kinder and gentler time it was to have the kind of easy communication with Lloyd Bentsen about a little problem that he has to have resolved. It is a different era, and the fact that it was revenue neutral was a great advantage to you in that effort. And even though you did come quickly together, it was a 2-year process of educating not only the public, but the members involved. I would argue that the interest groups that are embedded in tax expenditures are even stronger today. It isn't just about the guys who want to go sailing or go play golf. They've got their TV ads running. They've got their grassroots operations out there.
Vic, and there's one thing else. In 1986, there was no cell phones. There was no immediate communication. If they didn't like something, they had to go out in the hallway and find a wired telephone and call. And by the time they had done that, we had already passed it.
It was already on. So what I'm saying is this is very hard to do. And as Bill Gale outlined earlier, you can pretty much see where the groups are lining up. And the easiest thing they can bring about is gridlock and doing nothing. I am a firm believer that if we go back to the committee system, we can actually do more than having these kinds of general discussions. Because, as Will Marshall said, it's going to take a blend of policies, probably some rate changes, some base broadening. But let's see what the traffic will bear, what the political environment, the culture on the Hill will accommodate. And if there is
so
going
that
to be,
Dave Camp and Sander Levin cut a deal in the Ways and Means Committee, and Max Baucus and Orrin Hatch?
Begin the process, see what they can produce, and then begin the process of trying to confer. And if there's a new revenue source, a carbon tax, some sort of a consumption tax, it will emerge out of their common frustration that they can't get where they need to go. So what we need to do is don't micromanage, don't be prescriptive, give them the number, the ratio of expenditure reductions to tax reform, revenue enhancements. Give that task this fall to the committee, and over the next 6 or 9 months, task them to meet those numbers. I think the capability is there to do it. I mean, there may not be Rostenkowski and Packwood, but if there's a will, and I believe there is with the president and John Boehner, they will get the job done.
Peter?
Mike, yes, go ahead, John.
Could I just add an amendment to what Vic is saying? I don't think it's credible to kick the can down the road that far at this point. I think that the reaction in the real economy would be devastating. So you have to kind of imagine what you're suggesting, Vic, which I think is a good suggestion, in the context of doing something now. And whether that something is letting the rates snap back, as I would support, or
I don't disagree with you,
and taking some effort to restrain mandatory spending in order to offset the sequester, that has to happen now, or else we're really in the soup if we just let this thing slide for 6 months.
John Podesta, would Democrats be open to the notion that you don't kick the can, you allow rates to revert back for a period of time, but then you open the door when those discussions happen for a tax overhaul
I think
happens, that maybe rates come back down?
Democrats have the easy side of this position, which is that everyone agrees that taxes shouldn't go up on 98% of Americans. That's the Democratic position. I think that's the easy side of the position, but I think then they have to be open to what a tax reform discussion along the lines that Vic suggests, give you the opportunity to do in the course of a congressional process that could produce lower rates.
Michael Peterson, I want to get you involved in this. Financial markets, you worked on Wall Street, you know these things. They're waiting for something up front as well as something long term. We can't just kick the can down the road, right?
Absolutely. I think what I've been struck with the debate, particularly over the last 7 days, is the time, energy, and attention that has been spent on the weeds of these tax policies and the neglect of some of the broader challenges we face. This is probably the fantasy of Bill and Donald, that the entire world is focused on, capping deductions and what the ramifications are, and this is how they spend their lives, and so they're really in their element. But we sometimes lose sight of the broader goals here. And as Maya was saying, the first question I would want to answer is, does this package solve the problem? We have a short-term problem that's immediate with the fiscal cliff. We have a medium-term problem, which is the 10-year window. We're going to borrow $10 trillion unless we change our policies. I think $4 trillion is a minimum that we need to deal with there. And then we have what we feel is a primary threat to the future is the long-term problem. So before we get into the details of what the exact percentage should be, I think we need to make sure whatever we're negotiating solves those problems. The second level question is, how much is it from revenue and spending? I think it's essential that revenue be part of the equation, not only for political reasons, but numerically it's just difficult to do with spending cuts alone. You need to cut the budget by roughly 30% over the long term, and I just don't think that's going to be supported by the American people over the long haul. But we can't just worry about the details of the revenue without considering what we need to pair it with on the spending side in order to go back and solve those challenges. So, and the last thing I'll say is what you were talking about is, and Donald mentioned, is growth is the best way to raise revenue. And my concern is we spend all this time coming up with a small deal that isn't market confidence building, that isn't credible, and we end up hurting growth either through a bad process or a bad result, and that probably hurts us more on the revenue side than all the things we were arguing about. So I think it's essential that it solve these critical fiscal challenges, short, medium, and long term, and give the credibility and certainty that the market really needs.
The market and Governor Bredesen, what about the folks back in Tennessee? What are they expecting here?
If I had the opportunities, you asked someone here the opportunity if you could go to the Irish Times, which I presume is a pub in Washington, and people there together. Let me tell you what I'd say to them. This concern about taxes and revenues, it's part economic. You obviously don't want to hurt the economy or hurt the recovery. But it's largely just driven by fear. No elected official likes to go back and talk to people about having raised their taxes. You can see that in things like the way that the middle class is always exempted from everything on both sides of the aisle, which has nothing to do with policy. It's just got to do with a big group of constituents. So you want to tell them you're going to be okay. All this conversation, I've been sitting here listening. I'm certainly not a tax policy expert. is very abstract. I mean, this is a bunch of sort of guys with ties and one lady sitting around talking about these policy issues. If you stop somebody in the aisle of a Walmart and want to talk to them about taxes, there's nothing that's been said here which is the least bit persuasive, to them in the process. When I was mayor and raised property taxes twice, as governor, raised taxes in one particular area where I was there, in a very conservative state. And the way I got it done was always to tie it very specifically to something that they could make a judgment about. As mayor, I want to build schools in these locations on this schedule. I want to build a new arena or something like that, and so on. I can run the business. Don't give me any new taxes, and I'll still keep running the business. But these are the things I want to do, and you can pass them that way. You can see it in the federal government in things like Medicare. And Social Security. No one's out there arguing we got to cut Medicare taxes, we got to cut Social Security taxes, because they see them as tied to something very specific. It's money goes into a trust fund that's used for something for their benefit. So I just say that in the process of this, if you could bring this discussion much more fully home to, it's more than just fixing the debt. And the fact we've got this far, I think, is that that is a kind of a specific use of it. But bring it much more specifically home to some actual uses of this fund. How are you going to make the Social Security Trust Fund solvent over a long period? How are you going to, in combination with other things, make it work in Medicare? I think you'd find the resistance to this sort of stuff a great deal less. You started asking. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, do you think the president has made that connection with the outreach he's done since the election or during the course of the election?
No, I mean, I support the president totally, but no, I think it's still in a for lack of a better term, sort of a class warfare mode, and on both sides, and I just think that bringing it home, thinking about what you're really going to tell that person in the aisle of the Walmart or the Waffle House or wherever you see them about this, really takes you can take a lot of the sting out of this thing by tying it. I mean, there's other people here who have political things and have probably raised or may not have raised taxes and so on. I'd be interested in what you think. But to me, the secret was always give them something for what it is you're asking for and make it a real specific transaction, not just, the monster in Nashville or the monster in Washington wants some more of your money.
Well, one area where that should work, and I agree, Governor, that makes great sense. But one area where it should work is in road improvements and highway improvements. And Simpson Bowles suggested raising the gas tax 13.5%, because the Highway Trust Fund is running a negative balance and it's taking from the general fund, which it wasn't supposed to do. But you've got universal opposition to raising the gas tax, which is just, it makes no sense to me, because most people should want to have a gas tax increase if they know it's going to go to create a better road. And they know, and if they understood that the highway fund is running a deficit and therefore we're having to borrow from China to build the roads, it would be something I would think people would be concerned about.
Well, Judd, I accept the point in that any sort of tax increase has become problematical. But the gas tax I would add in along with Medicare and Social Security. No one's out there fighting to decrease the gas tax. There's no protests outside of gas stations, even though it's a very large thing. It's something which at least is accepted at that kind of a level. Whereas there's plenty of interest in cutting other kinds of taxes. I can tell you as an elected official. I just think that these things which are tied specifically to benefits that people can see and can grab onto are just much easier to do, and that there's some opportunity in this debate to do that.
I just want to make a quick point based on some of the research that we did when we were looking at this issue, which is, are people actually willing to pay higher taxes to reduce the deficit? And it turns out that overall people are, with one big if, and that is if they feel certain that it will actually go to reduce the deficit. And there's so little trust that revenues that go to Washington will be used there instead of for new spending or broken spending programs. So the two lessons we took from that is not only does it have to be a balanced package, which it has to be anyhow just to fix the problem, but you really need to find ways to dedicate the revenues to deficit reduction and also have enforcement mechanisms to make sure that any deficit plan, all of those savings proposals stay on track and are used only for what they're intended to be, because there isn't much trust about if what you're linking it to is reducing the deficit.
I want to bring it back a little bit to the reality of the day, and we are getting into the weeds on some of these things, and ultimately it's going to matter to folks in Tennessee. Mark Zandi, I want to get your take on, again, part of the debate in the discussion today. 39.6, a top rate. If we return to that, what we saw during the Clinton years, what's that going to do to the U.S. economy?
All else being equal, it would hurt, but I think it's necessary. You know, let me make a few points. First, I think tax reform is, you know, obviously better than raising tax rates. So raising the top marginal tax rate is less desirable than trying to scale back the deductions and credits in the tax code. And I think there are some reasonable approaches to tax reform. I wish, Bill, we were king for the day and could go through the code and decide what's good and what's bad. But, you know, given that that's not going to be the case, then I think proposals like Maya's or Governor Romney's or even the president's proposal to bundle it all together is reasonable approach to doing this. And I think actually at the end of the day, there's a lot of agreement here for tax reform. $800 billion from the Republicans. I think it's $600 billion from the president. I think there's room here for compromise. The second thing I'd say, though, is tax reform isn't going to generate enough revenue. If you do the arithmetic, you know, Dave has come up with $4 trillion. You know, I don't, by my calculation, we don't need 4, but it's a bigger number than just tax reform is going to be able to generate. So in that context, we are going to have to allow tax rates to rise. And if you had to pick a tax rate to increase that would do the least amount of economic damage, all else being equal, it'd be to allow that top tax rate on marginal income to go back to pre-Bush era levels. It's, you know, not something anyone would want to do, but, you know, given all the choices, that's the least negative. So I think that's a reasonable thing to do in the context of we're not going to be able to generate enough tax revenue through tax reform. So let me just give you the numbers I think would make sense in the context of the current debate. The president has said 1.6 trillion, roughly $1 trillion in tax revenue from higher tax rates, say 600 billion from tax reform. House Speaker Boehner is 800 billion from tax reform. You know, I think a logical number would be something like 1.4 trillion. 700 billion from reform, 700 billion from tax rates. You did that, you got, and we talked about some spending items earlier in the day. You could come up with some numbers that would work. And here's the bottom line. I think our goal in terms of the markets should be a deficit that's small enough at the end of the decade that our debt to GDP ratio stabilizes. It'd be great if we get it moving south, but if we can get it stable by the end of the decade, we're golden. I mean, golden in the sense that we're not going to solve our problems forever, but we're going to solve our problems now. The markets are going to be okay, businesses are going to be okay, and the economy's fundamentals will improve and we'll be in a much better shape.
Mark,
can I just add one? I want to see if anyone wants to weigh in. Senator Gregg, on the Zandi plan, 1.4 trillion in revenue, 700 billion from reform, some from rates.
The president's plan, because if you take the rates to 39.5. and then you cap deductions, what's your effective rate on the top income people? If you're putting another 700 billion on top of the 700 billion that you get out of the rates, what's your actual effective rate going to be?
On the folks that make over 250K?
Is it going to be 42, 43%?
Yeah, it'll
43?
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it will be about 42%. It'll get up to 40,
inject some facts
over 40%.
Here. The top rate is going up. Even if we don't raise it above 35, it's going up to 38.6 thanks to Obamacare taxes, okay? So if you also take it to 39.6 and then another 3.8 on top of that, you're in the 43-something range. That's the reality of raising the rates.
But you also cap the deductibility to get to 700,000. Doesn't that take that?
Well, that's why. I mean, Peter, you asked the question, can you get the money? It's right here. It's Tax Policy Center, October 17th. The answer is yes, you can get the money from the deductions. And the question is why we'd want to push the rates higher and higher and higher, why we'd want to move further and further away from the Simpson-Bowles proposal. No, it's just beyond me. And also, simply about the amount of money involved here, right? $4 trillion was, the Simpson-Bowles proposal was a placeholder to get us to more fundamental reform. In an era where, since then, we've had $1.2 and $1.3 trillion deficits. It is simply not going to be enough to get there. So let's do some realistic math here, which everyone is ignoring. If we have 12 trillion in debt, if we actually do an honest macro scoring of what's going to happen, we have 12 trillion in debt. To get to Mark's goal of stabilizing is not enough because we get the demographic bust happening to us in 2020. We actually have to have our debt coming down at the end of the decade to have any chance of surviving the entitlement problem. That was a topic that came up this morning. So that's not enough. So you've got to get to really a number like 6 or 7 trillion, okay? Let's give the president his fantasy about how much money he can get from the rich. Call it 1.8 trillion, okay? We've now got 4.2 trillion to go. I'm sorry, not fighting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq is not savings any more than me not buying a Maserati next year is savings to the Lindsay household. It's just not, that's just not a claim. Where are we going to get the money from? We're not going to get it this decade from entitlement reform. We're going to need that in the future. Say we get another 1.8 trillion in discretionary cuts. That gets us to 3.6. Where are you going to get the other 3 trillion? There's only one other moving part out here, and none of us are willing to admit it, and not both parties are against it. And that is, ultimately, you're going to have to get money from people other than the rich. And that's why I was interested in Maya's comment here. Maya, did they say, I'm willing to pay more taxes? Or did they say, I'm willing to have the rich pay more taxes when you asked them that survey? If they're actually willing to pay taxes, well, frankly, they're going to have to. And, you know, this idea that we should draw a line in the sand at 250 is not a very sensible plan. I mean, if you're actually going to deal with the long-run deficit problem, which you don't have to do in December, lots of people's taxes are going to have to go up in addition to the richest taxes.
What's the most appropriate way to do that then, if you need to capture more of that revenue, and again, you want to try and not do harm to the U.S. economy?
Well, the last thing you want to, I mean, we need really, really fundamental tax reform. That certainly helps. And we also need entitlement reform, and we also need to use cost-benefit analysis. I mean, what was shocking to me about the white paper the White House put out was the cost-benefit analysis that I described earlier. They were, by their own logic, proposing things where the costs were twice the benefits. If you run a government that way, I'm sorry you're going to go broke. It's very, very straightforward. So until we start bringing cost-benefit analysis into our calculations, then, you know, the rest of it is an exercise. We may as well go off the cliff or not go off the cliff. It really doesn't matter, because if it's not January 1, it's going to be not too long from now until we start taking a sharp pencil to everything and start doing a cost-benefit.
Can I just go ahead, quickly interject? You know, I sympathize with what Larry's saying, that what I'm proposing and what we're actually debating here is not to solve, we're not going to solve our problems ad infinitum into the future. I mean, we've got serious demographic issues that go out several generations. Our goal, which is an achievable goal, should be to nail down our fiscal situation over the next decade so that we get into a stable place in the coming decade. And that is very doable in the context of the debate that we're having right now. And if we get $3 trillion, and we can debate the arithmetic, and that's, I think, using reasonable assumptions about economic performance, just CBO kind of economic growth, we get there. And then we see where we are and see how the economy is performing 3 or 4 years down the road. Because as you know better than anybody, a 10th or 2% on GDP growth per annum can change these budget projections very significantly 20, 30 years from now.
And when was the last time we hit the CBO projection on growth?
Actually, if you go back, and we've got Rudy here who can attest to this, I mean, you go back in time, sometimes it's too high, sometimes it's too low. On average, they get it roughly right.
Since the crisis began.
Yeah.
Right. The president's budget, by the way,
that doesn't mean anything.
Growth for planning for next year.
That doesn't mean that they're going to be wrong the same way going forward, right, Larry?
Let me let Bill get in here.
All right, thank you. I wanted to come back to this question of what do we have to get decided and when, because there are a whole lot of separate conversations going on that are mingled. And I wanted to, I think I followed Larry's math this time. I didn't follow the first time he said it, but I wanted to come back to something Mark Zandi said, that basically you can think there's a short term, there's a medium term, and a long term. Right. Medium term is 10 years, short term is the next 2 to 5 years. Right. The absolute imperative is that they do something now to help the economy in the short term, to accelerate the recovery, to get going. The cost of doing that, given the long term problem, The cost of doing more now is the need to come up with a medium-term deal. So they need to do something to help the economy now. They need some sort of placeholder on 10 years, whether it's, I don't mean placeholder, I mean some sort of deal. It's not the grand bargain, but whether it's $2 trillion or $3 trillion, we need to show now that we can help the economy now, accelerate the recovery, and that we have a situation over the next 10 years that is reasonable, stable, not out of control. It would be nice if at the same time we could solve the problems 75 years ahead, but we never solve problems 75 years ahead.
Right.
And imposing that constraint on stimulating or helping the economy now and reaching a medium-term deal seems very unwise to me, and we should focus on what we can do. That's important. I think someone in the first session said this. We should focus on what we can do, which is do something for the economy now, come up with a 10-year stabilizing deal, and work on the long-term issues as we figure out what works in healthcare, what doesn't work, how much we want to reform Social Security, how well the economy is doing in 10 years, et cetera.
Michael? I have two issues with sort of ignoring the long term now. One is very important, which is most of the credible reform proposals to entitlements have a 10-year waiting period. So if you're not dealing with it now, you're saying, I don't want to deal with it in 11 years. And so I agree with you, we can't solve the next 75 years today, and certainly by the end of the year. But if we don't start tackling these things in conjunction with things like the fiscal cliff, which are very rare action-forcing events, when are we going to do it? And I agree that we need to delay the implementation of some of these for fairness and so that seniors can prepare. But I think we need to keep that in mind as we think about deferring them. Secondly, in terms of the 10-year versus the longer term, it's not that difficult to stabilize within the 10-year window. Okay, President Obama's budget actually does that according to his numbers. To me, I think the amount matters within the 10 years. What I care more about is what trajectory we're on after that point. If we've done $6 trillion and we've done nothing on the long-run entitlements, I think that's worse than doing $4 trillion and having some systemic reforms start kicking in years 11 through the next few decades. So I think it's important when we say stabilizing the debt, we mean stabilizing it not just for a couple of years and then having demographics kick in. It's stabilizing the debt and ideally putting it on a downward path towards.
Actually, if you look at the president's budget, he doesn't meet my standard, right?
Okay, well, let's
If
clarify.
you look at the end of the budget horizon, it's a little bit of a hockey stick, and the trajectory's wrong. So he hasn't gone far enough, and I agree. Okay. We need to address. He's fallen short on spending. He's got it on revenue, or pretty close. We need more on spending to get that trajectory at least stable to moving south as we move into the second 10 years of the budget horizon.
And just to follow up on my comments, I agree that we should be thinking about these long-term issues. Expecting them to come up with a short-term, a medium-term, and a long-term real solution all at once, I think is just way too much for any realistic expectation. And absolutely, they should address these issues. They should think about them. They should reform. They should experiment. But I'd hate to have the economy right now and the economy over the next 5 to 10 years held hostage because they can't agree on what health reforms are going to happen 20 years from now.
I want to get Will and Senator Packwood involved. Senator Packwood, go ahead.
Well, there's one other time when I've seen us act fast in addition to tax reform. It was either 89 or 90 when the market fell 600 points and it was 3,000 points, a 20% drop in one day, and within a week, members of Congress were sequestered. It had a different term than at an Andrews Air Force Base. We were locked in. And we met, and that's when the president said, okay, I'll give them tax increases. And Pete Domenici, by and large, came up with the caps, and the caps worked. And it only took us 4 or 5 days to come to it. But it was the market that drove us to it. Now, picture what would happen today if you had a 2,500-point drop in one day in the Dow. I'll bet you Congress would act within a week.
Is it going to take that?
I hope not. But that's what drove us to Andrews Air Force Base 20 years ago.
Will, you want to weigh in on that?
I see this as a kind of a three-stage rocket, this process of tax reform. This year, we're going to have a debate over rates. You can't avoid that. It's only a question of where that comes out and what room it leaves for compromise on a much bigger tax reform blueprint next year. And I'm hoping that we will not, again, make a fetish of the tax rate and look at the overall tax burden on wealthy people and decide what is reasonable for them to bear as their contribution to debt reduction. and, you know, and make sure we then proceed to the larger questions of tax reform, which are going to reach beyond the wealthy. I mean, we've got to be realistic here. You know, we're not going to hold the middle class harmless forever in this process, I don't think. Secondly, we haven't talked much about corporate tax reform, but you know, this is really a huge. If we, you know, this system is uncompetitive from a global standpoint. It leaks. Money contributes a diminishing amount of money to the Treasury. It's riddled with loopholes that distort sound business decision making. This has got to be changed as an economic imperative next year. And you know, we have U.S. companies sitting on $1.7 trillion of profits that, you know, we need to repatriate and get that money back in this country to invest, as Maya suggested. And thirdly, in the third stage, the longer run, we do need to look to new revenue sources. I don't think we can solve our problems, pay for an aging society, based on just looking at the income tax and payroll tax systems, which is why the carbon tax really does commend itself to me. What is your second principle? Tax that which you want less of, carbon emissions. MIT says a $20, you know, carbon tax will raise $150 billion a year. That's real money that we need not only to broaden the revenue base for an aging society, but it'll also help lubricate, you know, the kind of tough tax trade-offs and horse trading we're going to have next year.
Let me get Paul involved here on the corporate tax rate. We haven't talked about it all that much. Yeah. What would a 28 or 26% corporate tax rate mean to your business?
Huge. And it's not just the rate itself, it's the sense of a permanence, right? That we're actually going to do something comprehensive, long-term, and that it's real and is durable. Because that's what long-term planning is all about in a business context. I mean, again, you know, you're competing with the UK Parliament. You know, the UK put their tax rate to 28%, and there's no tax on repatriation. Hong Kong's at 16%. Singapore's at 17%. You know, Japan used to be the highest tax rate in the world, and we were second, and now we're first. So I would say that, you know, it's an imperative from a competitive point of view. And again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, when Dave was talking, it is the absence of any decision that's got that X trillion sitting on the sidelines waiting for some clarity about where we're going. Because my own view is that if you had the banner headline, you know, long-term fiscal responsible deal, you know, handshake is there, the framework's in place, we believe in these principles, and revenue is going to be part of it, I would gladly give up all the exemptions tomorrow, in a minute, if I thought it was real long-term, you know, entitlement reform that was going to put us on the 75-year trajectory.
Just to be clear, you're talking individual or the corporate?
I'm talking about the corporate side. I'll do it individually too. You can have it all. And you know, from my perspective, I'm part of that 2% that the people who are here this morning don't trust. But the point is, it's all about, are we going to do the hard things? Are we going to do it right? I'd give it up in a minute. And I'd even give up the 43% if I knew that it was all going towards the right thing and it was long-term comprehensive reform. I'm just telling you that. I would in a minute. And I don't think that I speak alone. I mean, this is the old Rousseau, je suis mort que les hommes. I know my own heart. I know the hearts of a lot of people. I think there's frustration out there, but in the business community, and I understand, and Judd has made the point that, you know, sometimes the business community they're sort of naive about the realities of the Washington world. And I think that we have to be respectful that these are difficult decisions, and it isn't coming in some, you know, easy, facile executive decision to make it all get better. But it is about, I would think we should frame it in terms of root cause and what allows the American economy to be the engine of growth for the world. What would trigger fundamental changes in growth? And it would be a deeper, more fundamental approach. I would welcome it. And lower rates and get rid of all the exemptions and make it clear and attract capital to the United States and compete with other markets. You know, U.S. companies are not just U.S. companies. They are global companies. Dave's company is global. Mine is global. And I think that that's the reality.
But let me ask you a fundamental question then. You talk about the other corporate rates, which is right. But under the OECD statistics, which are very good statistics, I find, every other industrialized country spends more totally and taxes more totally than we do. They do it in a different form.
Absolutely.
But they're higher than we are.
Right.
And 2030, well, OECD started in 50. In 50, we were all quite low. We were lower than the rest 50 years ago.
That's correct.
And we've all gone up. And I'm wondering if it doesn't lead to what you just said. Basically, we're going left. And Peggy Noonan had a column the other day, we're center left. Would we all be satisfied if we solve this fiscal problem and long term, and basically what we were doing was taking 50% of the GDP and spending it? And we'd say, well, at least we have stability. And at least we're paying for it, and we don't care that we're taking half of all the money in the country
Well,
and giving it government.
and Senator, I would say that to our discussion this morning, it's all about the quality of what you're getting. I mean, so if it's, I mean, Erskine Bowles is famous for saying, look, you spend all this money on health care, but what do you get for it? I mean, we don't rate on any of the rankings. You're 25th to 50th, life expectancy and infant mortality.
All I'm
what do you
is,
get for it, right?
Is the continued left movement inevitable? Mm-hmm. So we might as well figure a way to live with it, raise the money for it, and give up.
No, I'm not sure I'm in that camp.
Let me ask you one more thing on the corporate side, because every time we talk about the corporate tax code and overhauling it, we're talking about revenue neutral. At least that's been most of the proposals I've seen. What would the corporate community say if somebody came into the table and said, no, we'd actually like to get a little bit of revenue out of that? That's certainly something that, as I recall, happened in '86.
Yeah,
you
can have it.
Revenue neutral. Yeah. Simpson-Bowles took out $1.1 trillion of deductions and exemptions annually, took $1 trillion and used it to reduce rates, and took $100 billion and used it to reduce debt. So over 10 years, they had $100 billion of debt reduction.
I'm there. I'm not married to that. I think that the corporate world has, I think, very much in the camp of do what you've got to do as long as it's comprehensive, long-term, and I think the Bowles-Simpson framework was great. And gosh, if you could snap your fingers, you'd get it done tomorrow. We all know the political realities, but it's the absence of a decision that's hung on that's causing all that money to sit on the sidelines, which leads to, look, it all started with growth. What is growth? Growth is confidence, right? So how do you get, what would be the biggest single message you'd send to the world? Is you actually had the handshake, you built the framework, you were committed to do the right thing long term. It sends a huge message of confidence to the country, but also to the world at large.
Can I just challenge the numbers? You know, if you look at government revenue or, as a share of GDP, it has not increased over time.
No, I'm talking about spending. The spending we borrow the money or we tax the money, but the spending goes up.
The spending has increased since the recession, and it is elevated right now in large part because of the recession. But even spending since 1980, federal government expenditures as a share of GDP is pretty stable.
That's because we shipped it to the states.
Well, no, even if you throw in the states, it has.
Well, but here's the figures when you look at it.
Throw in the states, same deal, pretty stable.
But you say since OECD started after World War II, so the figures 100 years ago are difficult to come by, except by and large all the governments had balanced budgets then, so you could at least tell what their revenue was, and all governments spend all the revenue they get. But we didn't know what the GDP was, but best guesses are that we were spending, all governments, federal, state, and local, 7 to 10% of the GDP. We are now, all governments, federal, state, and local, are spending 42% of the GDP. Do we want to make any effort to stop that? Or are we just going to say, well, it's never stopped before?
Well,
it's beyond us?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the earlier period of obviously Social Security had not been fully implemented.
Oh, yeah.
There was no Medicare.
Well, that's correct.
Okay, so since we have those programs, you know, since 1980, as our starting point, there's no obvious upward tilt in revenue as a share of GDP or expenditure as a share of GDP. It's pretty stable. It goes up and down with the business cycle, but you know it's pretty stable.
One thing that's clear is that the fight between bigger and smaller government will go on forever. That this is sort of the division between the right and the left, and that if part of the resolution of that could be, we'll continue to fight about bigger government and smaller government, but we won't do it by refusing to pay for whatever size government we have and tanking the economy in the process. That would be a good start as a backdrop while that fight continues. I want to just touch on your question about corporate and individual taxes, because the third piece of this is also small businesses. And as we work out how you develop a tax code that's good for the economy, good for competitiveness, and good for stability, you need to think about how those three play into it. And I do think one of the things that you keep hearing through the messages from different groups of people, though, is while everybody's aware that this solution is going to take sacrifices from all sides, on spending, on revenues, from all different parts of that the confidence that you get from putting a deal in place for the short term, the medium term, and the long term actually has tremendous economic benefits, right? And that the cheapest form of stimulus is confidence. And if we can put that in place and people really believe that something's going to stick, it becomes a lot easier to be willing to sort of do your part in all of this. So I just think as those moving pieces and revenue are there, don't underestimate the benefit of knowing what the future holds.
Peter, could I just add one last piece on that? Because it ties into Michael's point as well. You know, there's a productivity. I mean, the amount of money that gets spent just maintaining and administering the complex tax code is just unbelievable. And I would much rather be spending that money. Just give me the simple system and let's get on with building my business. And I don't think that gets talked enough. And I know it's a side issue to it, but people just take that as a given, right? And I know Cody's got it and the rest of us have it. So we would gladly get rid of all of that in a minute. And it's a healthcare issue as well. We talked earlier about, technology and data sharing, and there's a lot of productivity issues that are embedded in this that are, I think, significant.
We just got a couple minutes left here. I want to touch on a couple other hot button topics that we haven't really discussed quite as much, and I want to bring Donald Marin back into it, get his expertise. Capital gains, dividends. Current laws, they go back up. Dividends treated as ordinary income, capital gains goes back up to 20%. How much revenue are we talking about there? And if those become bargaining chips and remain at their current levels, how much are we giving up?
Yeah, so as you say, right, scheduled under current law, the cap gains rate is today 15, scheduled to go to 20, but keep in mind that there are also the health reform taxes that go into effect, so we're actually talking 23.8. Similarly on dividends, currently at 15%, scheduled to go to ordinary rates, but then you need to add the 3.8 as well for people who have high enough incomes. So significant increases in both scheduled. Interesting fact is, as you think about the fiscal cliff and what's coming, one of the few places you can actually begin to see people responding to it is in their behavior around capital gains and dividends. So you have companies who are moving up their dividends into this year to take advantage, to help their shareholders take advantage of the lower rates. You see, and I expect you will see more of investors realizing capital gains this year in order to get lower rates. There's clearly money there, and there's clearly money that has, if you will, interesting distributional characteristics, right, which tends to be money that comes from high-income folks. And so as you think about an overall package and you think about the political process trying to structure a package that has a revenue goal and a distributional goal, my kind of political economic prediction is that you're going to see at least some of those increases occur. I personally would be surprised if the dividend rate went all the way back up to ordinary rates. If I remember correctly, the Senate has already passed a bill in which they would allow it just to stay at the cap gains rate and go from 15 to 20 plus the health reform ones. The president in his early budgets in his administration actually proposed just having dividends stay the same as capital gains rather than go to ordinary rates. So my guess would be that that's where we're going to end up.
From an economic perspective, what would you say is best? I mean, if rates go up, should dividend be the same as cap gains?
So I find it hard to, I've looked around and I find it hard to find an argument for why the dividend rate ought to be higher than the capital gains rate. I personally am sympathetic to the argument that some corporate leaders engage in empire building and look for excuses to keep cash in, and that there are benefits to having some of it paid out in regular dividends. So I'm sympathetic to having a lower dividend rate. The one caveat that is actually a Laffer curve effect, which is at some point, if you start talking about raising the capital gains rates to ordinary income rates, actually the models say that JCT uses or that we use suggest that you may actually go too far and start losing revenue just because capital gains are in some sense a discretionary, voluntary thing to realize. So I don't think, there shouldn't, I don't think practically be discussion about going that high. It's hard to go to war over the difference between, 18.8 and 23.8.
Anyone want to go to war over that?
I'm just throwing in the fact. Dividends is $198 billion.
Yes. And what's your own thought if it returns to ordinary rates? What happens?
Well, when it was first cut, which was in 2003, we were running into a problem because the stock market was down and America's pension funds were in trouble. We did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, which turned out to be too cautious, that the dividend cut was worth 8%, which say, 1,100 Dow points, something like that. I think that's probably right. There was a study recently done by a guy who founded DRI, sorry, I forgot his name, that it was actually about twice that, the effect. Oh, sorry?
Renner?
No, I'm sorry, it's out there, it's about twice that. So I do think that raising dividend and capital gains rates will have knock-on effects that we haven't anticipated, but there is a lot of money there. There's no question about it.
We haven't talked about the estate tax as well. Senator Gregg, some odd politics in the U.S. Senate over the estate tax. Could this whole deal blow up over the estate tax?
Mary Landrieu has been known to do very aggressive things on the floor of the Senate. So I wouldn't ever bet against Mary. That would be my one caveat. So I think you're going to end up with an estate tax at whatever number Mary wants it to be at.
Really? We've got about a minute or so left. I want to have Maya, of course, will get the final word. But anyone else want to weigh in on, again, you've got a unique opportunity here. The President, John Boehner, could be getting set to talk again later on this week. What advice would you give him on taxes?
Just on this last point, these are very minor issues in terms of total revenue derived, but they're very significant to members. If you were to tell the bulk of the Democratic caucus in the House that, you know, we were going to do something draconian to the inheritance tax, that could cost you a lot of votes. So this is a very carefully crafted, balanced package that has to emerge. And all these issues, as Bob well knows, need to be tested into a little focus group in the caucus on the conference side, because these can be symbolically important and blow the opportunity to do something broad-based and fundamental.
Do we end up back something close to Bowles-Simpson just because of that point?
I think we'd just be better off if Speaker Boehner and the President didn't publicly exchange their offers, because hopefully they're going to have to compromise. And the more times you commit yourself in public, the harder it is to make the compromise.
Let me go, we'll go around at least our former members of Congress here. Do they cut a deal, Congressman, to avoid the fiscal cliff before we actually get there?
I believe so.
Senator?
Yes, so long as you realize that the Treasury Secretary sets withholding taxes, and he doesn't have to raise them even if the taxes go up. And the sequester doesn't have to happen ratably month by month. You can do the sequester in the last month of 12 months if you want. So it gives the Congress another 8 or 9, or not 8, but probably 4 or 5 months into the next year before they have to reach a deal.
They could kick the can down the road, but who here thinks the market's not going to let them do that? There'll be punishment.
We'll be hugely punished.
Sooner rather than later, you think?
Immediately.
We haven't seen it so far.
I'm in the, the Ratner camp of, the herd will turn. We will be punished. And, Erskine's got a very famous line that says, we got away with it the last time because we were the best looking horse in the glue factory, or whatever he says. And we're not going to get it passed this time.
We're not going to get it passed.
There's no way.
No.
We will get punished.
The president doesn't want a deal.
We will get punished. And that is very dangerous for everyone, all of us.
And that cue from Larry Lindsay is great for me to remind you, you can watch the president on Bloomberg television shortly. He's going to be on at 12:30. So thank you all for a lively discussion, some interesting points made, and maybe some food for thought for the folks who have to make some of these decisions. And I'm going to hand it off to Maya.
I'll just say a quick thank you to the panelists. I think the one thing that struck me was how much, and this was probably by design, but how much of our discussion was not on the fiscal cliff per se, but actually the fact that what's really important here is avoiding the fiscal cliff, but using it as an opportunity to help address all of these huge fiscal issues. So I'm just delighted by the quality of discussion from our panelists, and thank you to everybody for attending today.
It sounds like the deal gets
Well.